Xi Jinping doesn't want you to see this. Behind China's sleek skyscrapers lies a crumbling facade of failure, and the cracks are growing. Entire cities abandoned. Military equipment that is better on the parade grounds than the battlegrounds. Debt piling up, buildings collapsing. These aren't just accidents. They're built deep into China's way of doing business, a way that it's desperately trying to cover up. Now we're pulling back the curtain, and once you see what they've stuffed behind it, you won't look at China the same way again. But there's so much to talk about. Where should you even begin? To get to the truth, it's best to start not in China, but in Pakistan. April 20th, 2015, Xi Jinping makes a historic visit to Islamabad to announce the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC. It's a grand ambition designed to do nothing less than change the course of global commerce. Instead of taking the long and difficult journey through the Strait of Malacca, ships would be able to park at the port of Gwadar. From there, the offloaded supplies could move up the infrastructure corridor through the Pakistani interior and on into China up to Kashgar. It's a route that's shorter, cheaper, and conveniently harder for the U.S. military to reach. But 10 years later, the project is troubled, to say the least. There were 90 projects envisioned along the corridor, but only 38 of them are done, with only 23 more under construction, and none of the critical special economic zones or industrial parks envisioned for CPEC have materialized. The route has even seen its fair share of terrorist attacks. And to make matters worse, the Gwadar port that was supposed to be CPEC's crown jewel is a massive failure. Only 22 ships parked there in its best year. That's not random. The port can only handle 137,000 standard shipping containers a year, and there's no plans to make it more capable anytime soon. With such poor prospects for income, all Pakistan's really gotten for its Chinese investments has been a mountain of debt it can't pay back. It needed a $7 billion bailout from the IMF in July 2024 and has tried to restructure its debt with the Chinese. CPEC's failure is a heavy-handed blow to China's image. Beijing likes to promote itself as the way of the future. It all goes back to Xi Jinping's worldview. If Communist China could become a model of international development, it would keep itself safe at home by discrediting liberal democracies and showing that there was an alternative after all. That's part of why he began the Belt and Road Initiative the year after he took power. CPEC was supposed to be the golden goose in that entire grand plan. Unfortunately, it's more like a lump of something else than it is a lump of gold, and it's hardly alone. All of the Belt and Road Initiative is in trouble. Not far from Gwadar, ships can dock in Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. The project was supposed to be another pearl, almost literally. Leaders in India were worried that it would be part of a string of pearls to encircle their country. They're not as worried now. The port proved to be such a financial disaster that the Sri Lankans couldn't pay back the loan they took from China, so they've had to lease it to Beijing for 99 years starting in December 2017. That year, only 175 cargo ships docked at the port. The Belt and Road Initiative once looked like a serious threat to the world order envisioned by the United States. Now, the real numbers are out. By 2023, China had tried to restructure over $78 billion worth of troubled overseas loans over the previous 3 years, and that's probably just the tip of the iceberg. China loaned about $1 trillion to BRI participating countries in the first 10 years of the project, but now the bill has come due on that spending spree. In 2010, only 5% of China's overseas lending portfolio supported borrowers in financial distress, Bradley Parks, executive director of Aid Data, told CNBC. By 2023, 60% of them did. But the Belt and Road Initiative's less than stellar success was just the canary in the coal mine. What was supposed to be the symbol for development abroad is instead becoming a symbol of failure at home because China spent a lot more money during those 10 years. Let's just say that the lending spree to less than credit-worthy projects didn't only take place outside of China's borders. Like in most financial manias, the expansion started rationally enough. Hundreds of millions of people had flocked from the Chinese countryside into the cities over the last few decades. In 1980, only 19.4% of China's population lived in urban areas. In 2024, it was 67%. That's over 500 million people, and there are 113 cities with over 1 million residents in China. Naturally, this trend led to a surging demand for new buildings, so they were built. All logical, all consistent. But in every economic boom, there is euphoria, and euphoria leads to questionable decisions. Chinese real estate developers went into warp speed with their building projects. With so much money sloshing around, there is even a sense of novelty to some of them. They built imitation cities of London, Paris, New York, and even Jackson Hole, Wyoming, complete with cowboys and Route 66, even though Route 66 goes nowhere near Jackson Hole. There's just one problem. Few souls count places like this as home. Welcome to China's ghost cities. In March 2025, there were an estimated 60 million unsold apartments, valued at $4.1 trillion, lying idle across China. This doesn't need to be a bad thing, you might think, with so many young people looking for homes and China desperately needing more new families to form. All that empty real estate should be a blessing. Let's say all those people got into the new homes. Would that solve the problem? Probably not. You know things are bad when China's own officials have to acknowledge difficulties, and that's exactly what one of them just did. He Kang, the former deputy head of the National Bureau of Statistics, mentioned that the available real estate could house up to 3 billion people. In other words, even China's population of 1.4 billion wouldn't be enough to fill its inventory of unused properties, unless all those people plan on becoming second home buyers, and there's hardly enough money in their hands for that, at current prices anyway. When mega developers like Evergrande and Country Garden start defaulting, Beijing's worst fears came true. Confidence evaporated, construction froze, millions were left wondering if their homes would ever be finished. Xi Jinping needed a fix, and fast. In 2020, his government imposed a bold-sounding reform, the Three Red Lines policy. It set strict caps on developers' debt relative to their assets, cash, and equity, designed to end speculative bubbles and force discipline into the market. But the timing couldn't have been worse. By capping borrowing so abruptly, the policy triggered a cash crunch just as demand was softening. Developers couldn't finish homes. Construction halted midway. Buyers who had already paid were left staring at half-built skeletons. Confidence collapsed. And something unprecedented happened in China, a mortgage boycott. In over 100 cities, thousands of buyers simply stopped paying. Social media lit up with video testimonies, and some even protested in public, an extremely risky act in Xi's China. This hit the banks and local governments. Many of them rely on land sales to property developers to fund basic services, up to 40% of local revenue in some regions. When that stopped, they couldn't pay teachers, nurses, or construction workers. Beijing scrambled to contain the crisis. It injected capital into local financing platforms, told state-owned enterprises to buy up unsold apartments, and announced a $41.5 billion rescue program for distressed assets. But underneath all of that, a growing fear that no matter how bad the decisions, someone will always be bailed out. Moral hazard had entered the chat. Worse still, China's real estate demand isn't coming back. The population is aging fast. The fertility rate hit 1.01 in 2024. Fewer young people means fewer buyers, and even those who can buy aren't. They're part of the lie-flat generation, disillusioned, underemployed, and refusing to play the rigged game of property ownership. Why mortgage your future in a broken system? Xi's housing crisis isn't just about money, it's about trust. For decades, Chinese families were told that real estate was the safest investment. Now, many of those homes are worthless or don't even exist. It's not just a collapse in concrete, it's a collapse in belief. And after all that intervention, from bailouts to propaganda, the slide kept going. Despite these efforts, home prices still fell by almost 10% in the first third of 2024, so Beijing ordered that $41.5 billion be made available for state-owned companies and local governments to buy unsold real estate for affordable resale. That program worked too, supposedly. Chinese officials say the deflation ended by October, but you probably know what the phrase Chinese officials say is worth by now. In reality, it's more like a pause than an end to the price drops. With a fertility rate of only around 1.0 and a population now in decline, the real estate sector in China will only get more distressed with time. We wouldn't blame Xi for wanting all that money spent on Belt and Road projects back. Speaking of the Belt and Road Initiative again, we would be doing you a disservice if we didn't point out another way in which the troubled project abroad was a canary in the coal mine for bigger problems going on back home. It's not just about the money. Let's go abroad again, to Thailand. But before our flight lands, please consider subscribing if you like what you're seeing now. It helps us to continue telling stories like this about important events in the world. Now back to the programming. We've arrived in Bangkok, and this is its Pink Line monorail. It began construction in 2017. It's not a Belt and Road deal, but China's CRRC Pujin Alstom Transportation Systems Limited was involved in the manufacturing process. Xinhua, the Chinese government's official press agency, put out a self-congratulatory headline on December 15, 2023. China-made monorail trains provide ease of transport for people traveling between suburbs, center of Bangkok. The line officially launched 3 days later. It only lasted a week before suffering an embarrassing setback. On Christmas Eve, almost 1,000 feet, 300 meters of electrified conductor rail fell on the road below the Samaki station, and additional 2.5 miles, 4 kilometers of it, was left precariously hanging above the street. The Thai government's response was to extend the free trial period for rides, but maybe it should have taken up a Chinese phrase and asked Beijing whether this was another tofu drag disaster. That label comes from a much worse disaster in China, but with similar results. On May 12, 2008, China experienced one of its worst natural disasters in recent history when a magnitude 7.9 earthquake struck in China's Sichuan province. Almost 90,000 people died in the chaos, but that chaos wasn't entirely caused by the forces of nature. It turns out that China's massive urban boom cut a lot of corners, especially in the smaller provinces. One of the worst tragedies in the earthquake was the collapse of over 7,000 schoolrooms. Over 5,000 children died in the quake. Some estimates go as high as 5,600. People demanded answers. One construction engineer who wisely went by the pseudonym of Bookblade mentioned that schools were among the most badly constructed buildings in China. That's partly because of widespread corruption. He said, add in exploitation by government officials, education officials, school managers, etc., and you can imagine what's left over for the actual building of schools. And so the term tofu drag was born. It's a pejorative meant to describe badly built architecture that cuts a lot of corners for reasons that aren't above board. And they're not just limited to schools. Let's go back to Bangkok. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Asia saw another huge earthquake in March of this year. 7.7 magnitude one hit the border between Thailand and Myanmar. It was still powerful enough to shake the buildings in the capital, but all of them survived. All of them except one. A building called the State Audit Office collapsed. Who built it? You know, it was a Chinese state-owned company. 15 people died. When the Thai authorities investigated, they found something that probably won't shock you. Metropolitan Police Bureau Deputy Commissioner Nopasin Poonsawat laid out the conclusion. Expert assessments revealed that the architectural design did not comply with ministerial regulations or meet the technical standards outlined in the terms of reference. Basically, the Chinese developers fudged the paperwork. The steel and concrete was substandard. Even the engineering docs had forged signatures. Another tofu drag project, in other words. Questionable building projects can't be written off as appearing only in backwater schools or badly planned Belt and Road developments abroad. They're entrenched in China's heartlands. The Thais turned to the Chinese for their Pink Line monorail because they have a lot of experience building high-speed rail. The numbers tell the story. China has the world's longest high-speed rail network at nearly 28,000 miles, 45,000 kilometers. It hasn't suffered such an embarrassing incident as the Pink Line did, but it is suffering from something way worse. This symbol of national pride has the same financial profile as many of the Belt and Road deals. Only 6% of all that mileage is actually making money. Even the most profitable of the lines, the one between Beijing and Shanghai, will have to spend 20 years to recover its investment of about $31 billion. You've seen China's real estate debt crisis. Welcome to the next financial panic, the high-speed rail debt crisis. How big is it? The state-owned China Railway is the biggest player in China's high-speed rail space, and it had $890 billion worth of liabilities at the end of 2024. The similarities with the real estate crisis have an air of tragicomedy to them. After all, what's a ghost city without a ghost high-speed rail station? But at least they're easier to shut down. 20 have in the past 15 years due to lack of passengers, and that's not only because a lot of the lines connect to places they probably shouldn't. A lot of people just can't ride the trains, even if they wanted to. Many riders are temporary workers returning to the countryside after a stint in the city. The problem is that they can't repeat the journey that often. Remember, China's GDP per capita was only $13,000 in 2024. Repeated rides on the train would just send these people to the poorer house rather than the poorhouse. The government has recently raised ticket prices on the most profitable 20% of the country's train lines, letting the more affluent ridership there subsidize the more distressed parts of the rail network. But with China's economy slumping and people complaining about basic expenses like rent, it's not going to be a workable long-term solution. In 2011, President Obama was full of praise for China's high-speed rail network. One wonders if he's feeling hoodwinked about it now. And for China, the worst humiliation might still be to come. We all know the one thing the Communist Party values more than anything else: military power, and the country has spent a lot of money on it, but maybe not always in the way it wanted. On paper, at least, things look good. China announced a budget of $246.5 billion for its military in 2025. That's up 7.2% from 2024 and up over 3 times from 2008, when it became the world's second biggest military spender. That's just the announced budget, by the way. The Pentagon thinks the real numbers could be 30 or 40% higher than the official figures. But you don't need to look at the ledger to see the results of this breakneck buildup. Look up in the sky. In 2008, China was still flying 1960s-era aircraft like the J-7. Not even 10 years later, it had what it calls a fifth-generation stealth fighter, the Chengdu J-20. Look to the seas, and you'll see China's Navy with more ships than any other. 405 total hulls, including a domestic aircraft carrier, the Fujian, complete with a catapult-assisted takeoff. Then there's the prized rocket force. China has built an arsenal of thousands of ballistic and cruise missiles that keep the U.S. military and its allies up at night. The arsenal includes the medium-range DF-17, complete with a hypersonic glide vehicle that can snake past the most sophisticated missile defense systems. China is even expanding its nuclear forces. New silos in Xinjiang and the Type 096 Tang-class ballistic missile submarine indicate that China could have over 1,000 operational nuclear warheads by 2030, rivaling the arsenals of the United States and Russia. Well, maybe. In late 2023, Xi Jinping was in the midst of another of his periodic purges. It started with the defense minister Li Shangfu that October. He wasn't seen for 2 months. Turns out there was a good reason for it. He was being investigated for corrupt procurement of military equipment. The nature of the corruption wasn't specified, but people who were actually familiar with China's military practices could already smell what was going on under the hood. Soon, over a dozen top officers in the Chinese military were fired. Xi hoped to keep this all quiet, but in January 2024, the details started to come out, and they should make you question everything you've heard about China's military. The purge was concentrated in the rocket force because a lot of those base and ship-killing missiles you've seen in China's military parades might not be good for killing much of anything. Why? They're filled with water. Literally. Corrupt Chinese officers took to putting water in their hardware to make it look great. Good for parades, bad for battles. The problems didn't stop there. Those new silos, at least some of the lids didn't fit right, which means the missiles wouldn't launch even if they were filled with real fuel. So where did the money for these things go? You might have guessed by now. It turned out that for all of Xi's reforms, things hadn't changed too much in China's military. Yao Cheng, a former Chinese lieutenant colonel who defected to the U.S. in 2016, mentioned what really goes on with China's huge military budget when he spoke to Radio Free Asia as the scandal percolated around the newswire. It turns out, officers take money from the equipment department for dinners and gifts because that's where all the funds are. And what about the fuel? Sometimes troops need it for cooking. No, really. Yao said that supplies are often scarce, so the troops take a piece of solid fuel from the rockets and use it to cook hot pot. Xi thought that he'd gotten rid of corruption in the Chinese military as part of his reforms after coming into power. Over a decade later, it was still so serious that the U.S. intelligence community believed it could undermine China's military readiness at just the time it wanted to be capable of making the move on Taiwan. We already know from Russia's problems in Ukraine just how serious these corruption problems can be. Does Xi really want to take the chance? The latest bout of corruption in China's military tells us a lot about the nature of its communist-led revival since Deng opened it up in 1978. Is the country richer? Yes. Is it more capable? Yes. But the gulf between appearance and reality is still much wider than you think. And if you can cut through Xi's smoke screen of hype and censorship, you'll find it right under your nose, sometimes tragically. So what does all this mean for China's future and for the rest of us? That's the story we'll keep following. If you want deeper insight into how global powers rise, fall, and reshape the world we live in, subscribe to Fall of Nations. It helps us keep telling stories that go beyond the headlines, and it really helps keep this channel going. And if you want to see where this all leads next, watch this video. Still think China isn't lying? Watch this before you speak again.